A fingerprint on a window, mysterious photos on a bed, a vigilante lurking in the shadows. 10 years of silence are about to end. Justice has a price, and this time it will demand everything. I'm Clyde, and the storm is coming. Hear the full story on the Best Mystery Book Podcast.
Part 3. The Return. Where is Alexandra Quinlan? Tracy Kerr? Camp Montague, Appalachian Mountains. 8 weeks each summer. It was how her older brother had always spent the hot months of June and July. Ever since he was 13, she'd seen the school year end one day and her brother pack for camp the next. It was how summers had always worked. This year, however, was different. This year, she was 13 and finally old enough to join him. Her brother would be 18 in July, and this marked his 5th summer at Camp Montague, his last and her first. The excitement started back in May as soon as the weather turned warm. She daydreamed about a summer filled with canoeing down the river, late-night campfires, movies on the big screen under the starry night, and 1,000 other highlights she'd heard her brother speak of over the years. She rode in the back seat and zoned out her parents' grown-up talk as they headed into the mountains. It was all she could do to contain her excitement. Her older brother sat next to her and worked hard at nonchalance. He was a 5th-year Montague veteran, after all. But she still sensed his excitement. It was surreal to imagine that she would finally get to experience the glorious 8 weeks at Camp Montague. She had no idea about the terrors that waited for her there. No idea about the predator hiding in the shadows and salivating over the influx of new arrivals. But she soon would. The campfire began to dwindle. She had learned over the last couple of weeks that, when the camp counselors stopped adding logs to the fire, it meant the night was coming to an end. And when the fire died, it was time to head to her cabin and go to sleep. The older kids, the 5th years, didn't always follow that rule. They stayed up playing cards and sometimes sneaked beer from the main cabin's refrigerator. Her brother had told her stories. Some nights the 5th years even snuck out of their cabins to go on late-night adventures. But those things were reserved for the seasoned kids who'd spent most of their childhood summers at Camp Montague. For her, the slow dwindling of the campfire meant just the end of another great day at camp. At least it had for the first 2 weeks. Those early days had been glorious and exciting. They were everything she had dreamed Montague would be. And when the fire died each night, she was happy to climb under the covers and read while her roommates slept. During that first week, she had to work through growing pains and homesickness. Her new book, Double Crossing, the first Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys super mystery, helped, as did the fact that her brother was a constant presence around camp. As a 5th year, her brother was in charge of organizing activities for the first years, and though he'd never admit to it, she knew he was keeping an eye out for her. They didn't talk much, but a subtle nod here and a smile. There was all it took to ease the ache of being away from home. But just as the homesickness began to ease, it happened. It was the night her life forever changed. The campfire had lost its luster 30 minutes earlier, and the kids had begun the slow shuffle toward their cabins. Once she was back in her cabin and had brushed her teeth and changed into pajamas, she climbed into bed and pulled the covers over her head, then clicked on her flashlight to read. She heard her roommate finish in the bathroom and settle into bed. 10 minutes after the lights went out, she heard the deep breathing of her sleeping roommate. She spent 30 minutes reading and was deep into the book's adventure when her cabin door opened. She froze under the covers and listened for a moment. Then she heard heavy footsteps walking into the cabin. She slowly pulled the covers down to see Mr. Lawland, one of the camp counselors, standing over her bed. There were several camp leaders who oversaw everything that went on at Camp Montague. Mr. Lawland was in charge of the first-year squad. And now, tonight, an hour after the campfire had died to mark the end of a Montague day, he was standing next to her bed. "I was just reading my book," she said, worried that she had broken the lights-out rule. "Come on," he said in a whisper. "You have to come with me." She swallowed hard. "Where?" "Shh." He held his finger to his lips, nodding at her sleeping roommate. "You have to come now." Still shaking off the last remnants of homesickness, she found something comforting about a grown-up interacting with her. But in the strange setting when the rest of camp was asleep, it was terrifying too. She wanted to pull the covers over her head and get lost again in the adventure she was reading, but Jerry Lolland would not budge. He continued to stare at her with bloodshot eyes, breathing loudly through his mouth. The standoff lasted just a few seconds before she pushed the covers to the side and stood from bed. "Good girl," Mr. Lolland said, putting his hand on the back of her neck and leading her out of the cabin. He quietly closed the door behind them and led her through camp. The campground, populated with over 100 kids just an hour ago, was now desolate. Porch lights shined from each cabin. She glanced at the cabin's windows as she and Mr. Lolland walked past, but they were all dark. Far off in the distance, the main lodge still had activity going on inside. She thought, for just a fleeting moment, to run there. Surely the other counselors were still awake at this time of night and planning the following day's activities. There would be grown-ups there. There would be help. Inside the main lodge would be someone other than Jerry Lolland. As if he read her mind, Mr. Lolland twisted his hand on the back of her neck to steer her body away from the main lodge. After a few more strides, they arrived at his cabin. "I need to show you something inside," he said. "Inside your cabin?" she asked. "Yes. It will just take a minute. Am I in trouble?" "Not yet," Mr. Lolland said in a soft voice. "But you will be if you tell anyone about this. Tonight is our little secret." She swallowed hard as Jerry Lolland guided her into his cabin. Present day. Chapter 19. Manhattan, New York, Sunday, January 15th, 2023, 8:45 p.m. Tracy Carr put the final touches on her article, resisted the urge to read through it one more time to make additional changes, attached it to the email, and hit send. There was always a moment of panic after emailing an article to her editor and knowing that it was out of her control, knowing that her editor might read her work and think the content was worthless and the writing amateurish. This worry arose from an irrational mixture of neurosis and OCD, the curse of just about every writer she knew, but not from a lived experience. In the 5 years she'd worked as an investigative reporter for the New York Times, her editor had never rejected any of Tracy's articles. Tracy carried some level of clout as a reporter, and she was sure that helped. After breaking the story about the Quinlan family murders 10 years earlier, when she worked as a local reporter in Virginia, Tracy rode that fame and left Channel 2 News out of Richmond for greener pastures. Recruited first by the legendary television news magazine host Mac Carter, Tracy was a correspondent for American events for a number of years before her rise to television stardom stalled, when a young journalist named Avery Mason stormed onto the scene and overshadowed anything Tracy had ever accomplished in journalism. Avery Mason went on to take over American Events, a gig Tracy had been in contention for, and the cutthroat environment of television news proved too daunting for her. Tracy instead took to, and flourished in, the new era of reporting, the internet. Her stories had been so powerful, and her social media following so large, that the New York Times hired her to write about crime. Tracy won accolades for an investigative piece she did on the bribery of a sitting senator that included Tracy going undercover as a small business owner attempting to procure favorable tax breaks and building permits to get her business off the ground, all in exchange for healthy campaign donations. When the story broke, the accused senator was forced to resign in disgrace. Writing for the Times was Tracy's day job. Her real passion, however, was true crime. But the gig at the newspaper lent Tracy credibility that many of her true crime cohorts lacked, and writing for one of the leading papers in the country added to her digital platform. Her social media accounts boasted 5 million followers, and her self-produced videos covering true crime were must-see events when she released them. If a suburban mom was murdered or new developments came to light about a girl who'd gone missing years before, Tracy Carr was immediately on the story, and offering updates to her millions of followers. The best part was that as long as she got her work done for the newspaper, her editor didn't care what Tracy did in her spare time. Tracy closed out of her email account and pulled up the video editor on her desktop to rewatch the footage that she would drop tonight. She had lured her fans with teasers for the past month as the 10-year anniversary of the Quinlan family shootings approached, and had even returned to McIntosh, Virginia, for the first time in years to capture the perfect footage. She pressed play and watched the clip to see if any last-minute edits were needed. Tracy stood in front of the two-story home. The cedar sported a fresh coat of paint, applied the previous spring. Throughout the summer, the manicured lawn glowed a lush green hue, compliments of a sprinkler system that ran like clockwork. Now, in the dead of winter, a snowplowing company routinely cleared the driveway and sidewalk after each snowfall. Without any previous knowledge of the home's history, it would be impossible to know that a decade earlier, it was the site of a triple homicide and had sat vacant ever since. Tracy raised the microphone to her mouth and looked into the camera. I'm Tracy Carr, and behind me is the infamous home where, 10 years ago, the brutal killing of the Quinlan family took place. On that fateful night, Dennis Helen and 13-year-old Raymond Quinlan were shot in the middle of the night. I was the first reporter on the scene that night, breaking a story that would eventually rock not just the town of McIntosh, Virginia, but the entire country. A fated transition took viewers back to the night of January 15, 2013, where a then 32-year-old Tracy Carr interviewed the neighbor who had first called 911 to report shots fired inside the Quinlan home. The footage progressed to the front door opening, and a female officer, unknown at the time, but now familiar to true crime buffs as Donna Koppel, the officer who would eventually provide key testimony in the case of Alexandra Quinlan versus the state of Virginia, walking into the hot lights of both Tracy's television camera and the spotlights the McIntosh Police Department had erected. Officer Koppel led Alexandra Quinlan, hands cuffed behind her back and her eyes empty in a 1,000-yard stare, out of the house. In the days that followed, that image of Alexandra Quinlan made its way onto every newscast in the country. The video faded. Alexandra Quinlan's face slowly blurred as the footage transitioned back to Tracy Carr. 10 years have passed since I stood outside this house, knowing only that shots had been fired within. At the time Alexandra Quinlan was taken into custody, I knew only what the rest of the world knew. But then I started digging. Soon, I uncovered startling details about that night. The empty eyes Alexandra offered the camera have continued to haunt those of us who seek the truth. Had a teenaged girl miraculously survived the night, an armed intruder entered her home and killed the rest of her family? Or had those empty eyes been a dead giveaway that Alexandra Quinlan had not escaped the shotgun blast that killed her family, but had instead been the one who pulled the trigger? Tracy walked up the driveway of the home. For 10 years, questions have loomed. For a decade, the Quinlan home has sat vacant, yet perfectly maintained. We know that the property fell briefly into foreclosure in the months after the murders, but was then purchased by an anonymous trust. The house has been meticulously maintained ever since. Yet, when I look into who hired the landscaping company that maintains the grounds during summer and plows the snow in the winter, or the company hired to paint the home last year, or the company that installed the sprinkler system, I run into nothing but dead ends. Similarly, when I approach the utility companies to see who pays the electric and gas bills, I'm stonewalled. We know that the property came out of foreclosure soon after Alexandra Quinlan won her case against the state of Virginia, a settlement that awarded her millions of dollars. We've suspected that Alexandra is behind the anonymous purchase, and many of you armchair detectives at home have searched for proof. But protected by a small fortune and an army of attorneys, Alexandra Quinlan has not only managed to keep the trust anonymous, but to stay hidden for the better part of a decade. No one has seen or heard from Alexandra since she walked out of the courtroom the day the jury made her a very rich woman. There have been reported sightings from California to New York and as far as London, England. But every one of those leads has turned up exactly nothing. Alexandra Quinlan up and vanished years ago. Despite my best efforts and non-stop searching by many of you at home, Alexandra has managed to stay hidden ever since. On the 10-year anniversary of the shootings, my question is this. Tracy looked directly into the camera. "What are you hiding, Alexandra?" Tracy turned away from the camera, walked to the front door of the Quinlan home, and knocked on it. She waited a moment as if someone might answer, then turned back to the camera. As we mark the 10th anniversary of the Quinlan family killings, we continue to search for answers. We continue to search for the truth. We continue to search for Alexandra Quinlan. If she is the innocent victim she claimed to be during the trial that netted her millions, why did she go into hiding after the case was settled? Perhaps there is a simple explanation, and it is this: instead of an innocent victim, Alexandra Quinlan is a ruthless killer who not only got away with murder, but millions on top of it. Tracy walked off the front stoop until she was close to the camera. Her breath was a white vapor in the cold, January air. "I'm Tracy Carr, and I promise you that as the 10th anniversary of the Quinlan family murders comes and goes, I will spend every day continuing to search for answers. With your help, maybe we'll find them. With your help, maybe we'll find empty eyes. We know she's out there somewhere." Tracy stopped the video. Satisfied, she uploaded it to her social media accounts. Before midnight, it had racked up 3 million views. 2 weeks later, 22 million people had watched it. The world, or at least a select corner of it, was still obsessed with Alexandra Quinlan. Chapter 20. Washington, D.C., Friday, February 3rd, 2023, 11:48 p.m. In the 10 years since the fateful night that forever changed her life, the media's breathless pursuit of Alexandra Quinlan had ebbed and flowed. At times, it quieted down entirely as the lens of the mainstream media refocused on other misfortunes and tragedies. But interest never seemed to die completely. And ever since the 10-year anniversary had come and gone, activity on the true crime sites had been on the uptick. Tracy Carr was at it again, and Alexandra Quinlan's sightings had started to pop up anew. So far, though, the precautions put in place years earlier after Alex returned from the debacle in Cambridge, when 2 crazed true crime fanatics had followed her across Europe and attempted to extort $500,000 from her, had been effective at protecting her anonymity. The strongest safeguard was the name change. With the Social Security Administration, the Internal Revenue Service, the D.C. Secretary of State's office, and everywhere else formal documentation was required. She was legally Alex Armstrong. It had a nice ring to it, and over the years Alex had even grown comfortable with her new name, but it was just one of many firewalls erected since her return from Cambridge. The physical makeover had been just as important. Only a couple of years from her 30th birthday now, Alex was a long way from the baby-faced teenager most people knew as Alexandra Quinlan. Today, she was unrecognizable from the infamous image of the wide-eyed kid who had walked from her home and into the hot lights of the news camera the night her family was killed. That image had circulated so widely around the country and most of the world that it had burned itself into the thaw. Public psyche. Mention Alexandra Quinlan, and most people conjured that very image in their minds. The natural evolution from adolescence, the thinning of her face as baby fat melted from her cheeks, the maturing of her body, and the youthful aging in the eyes and lips, prevented the casual observer from recognizing her today. But so too did the self-induced alterations to her body. Her once long and wavy hair was now cut into a short, spiky crop. The auburn highlights were gone, replaced by yellow blonde. Her eyes were never without a dark ring of eyeliner, and the piercings were dramatic and everywhere. Her nose, her eyebrow, her lip, and in arching rivets along the cartilage of her left ear. The glasses she'd worn throughout her teens And for the entirety of the highly watched trial that defined her persona, had been replaced by contact lenses that changed the color of her irises from dark brown to vibrant blue. She wore black lipstick one day and bright orange the next, the wild spectrum of colors chosen each morning based on her mood. The oxymoronic plan of standing out was what helped her blend in. Together, it had all been enough for Alex to live a quiet existence in the DC area without being recognized or harassed. Of course, taking a job as a legal investigator for Lancaster and Jordan was another important move. Working for Garrett Lancaster's law firm allowed gainful employment without having to go through a formal background check. The job came when Alex was at the end of her rope, had nowhere to go, and was on the brink of twisting her life into an unrecoverable tailspin. Garrett's offer of employment was her last shot at finding normalcy and balance in a life that had been teetering on the edge 2 years after her family was killed. Had Alex not found purpose at Lancaster and Jordan, she would likely never have found it at all. During her introductory years at the firm, just after her return from Cambridge, Alex had worked under the tutelage of Buck Jordan, the firm's lead investigator, and the brother of Lancaster and Jordan's co-founder and senior partner. Hired at the firm's incorporation, Buck possessed the longest tenure of any employee. He'd been chasing leads for Lancaster and Jordan for over 2 decades. A third of his life had been spent following suspects, taking recon pictures, logging hours on stakeouts, and completing his fair share of opposition research. Buck Jordan had forgotten more about the law than the snot-nosed rookies who joined the firm straight out of law school would ever learn. And everything Buck knew, he taught Alex. She'd become his protégé. Years earlier, Buck Jordan had been instrumental in providing opposition research when Garrett Lancaster went after the McIntosh Police Department and the Allegheny County DA's office during Alex's defamation case. Alex was happy to be under his tutelage. The education was hands-on and still ongoing today, which was why Buck had accompanied her on that night's stakeout. Alex sat behind the wheel of her SUV, which was parked in front of a meter she had fed for hours, and focused the lens of her Nikon Coolpix Pone 1000 on the front entrance of the high-rise building across the street. Her right leg was starting to go numb as midnight approached, but the waiting didn't bother her. The aggravation of her sciatic nerve was ignored, and Alex considered the formal transition from today to tomorrow as simply the beginning of the night. 28 years old and powered by rebellion, regret, and Red Bull, it took more than a boringly long stakeout to discourage her. Her subject came into view through the lens of the Nikon as the man exited the building. Buck sat in the passenger seat and looked up from his phone when Alex began snapping photos. "We found our man," Buck said. "Are you getting clear shots of his face?" "No," Alex said. "Just his shoes." Always the smart ass. Once her subject was out of range, Alex handed the camera to Buck. Her stakeout had officially ended. Now it was time to get to work. Garrett had put her on the Byron Zell case to get information, and she had no intention of letting him down. Chapter 21. Washington, D.C., Friday, February 3rd, 2023, 11:56 p.m. One of the many responsibilities of the firm's investigators was to look into potential clients to determine whether they were innocent of the crimes they were accused of or as guilty as sin. It was common practice in criminal defense to never ask clients about their guilt or innocence. If an attorney had to ask, it meant they had doubts, and if they had doubts, they could not mount a viable defense. But at Lancaster and Jordan, the question was unnecessary. Every client was innocent till proven guilty, and the firm had a score of investigators to verify it. Byron Zell's former employer had accused him of embezzling company funds, and Mr. Zell had approached Lancaster and Jordan seeking legal representation after he was terminated and brought up on charges. An executive vice president with nearly 2 decades of loyalty to his company, Zell vehemently denied the allegations during his initial consultation with Garrett Lancaster. Alex had been tasked with looking into Mr. Zell. The case was technically hers, and hers alone, but as was common with mentor and protégé, she and Buck routinely worked cases together. 8 years in, Alex no longer needed the supervision. She just preferred the company. Her goal was to dig deep enough into Byron Zell's life to determine, not unequivocally, but damn close, whether he was an innocent man fighting for his livelihood or as guilty as sin. The process by which Alex went about this task fell into the hazy moral area of legal investigation, the specifics of which were left up to the imagination of each investigator. Alex Armstrong had an active imagination. Alex believed that Zell's finances were the best place to start her dive into the man's life. Zell had already turned over financial documents to Lancaster and Jordan, and Alex had spent the past week picking through the man's bank accounts, investments, and assets. So far, everything Byron Zell presented to Lancaster and Jordan had been on the up and up, but Alex hadn't expected to find anything nefarious in the documents Zell had willingly provided to the firm. If the man was hiding something, it would be on his personal computer, and Alex was about to have a look. As soon as Zell disappeared around the corner of the building, Alex pulled her ball cap low over her eyes. "Did you practice on the lock?" Buck asked. "Yes." "How long?" "All of last night." "No. How long to pick it?" "Under 2 minutes." Buck nodded. "You'd best hurry." Alex opened the door and hustled across the street. Vetting clients was instrumental to winning cases, and no laws could be broken in the process. Garrett had been explicit about this with Alex during her formal interview with the firm. The firm needed to know the truth about potential clients, but that truth had to be obtained legally. Garrett had lectured her about this once. He explained the firm's rules and the ramifications of obtaining information illegally during her intake interview, a meeting that included both Jacqueline Jordan, Garrett's partner and the other founding member of the firm, and Buck Jordan. Garrett told her this to get it on the record, and then never mentioned it again. Instead, he unleashed Alex at the ripe age of 21 to learn the tricks of the trade from the legendary Buck Jordan, a man who had broken more laws in the pursuit of justice than any of the clients Lancaster and Jordan represented. Over the years, Garrett had never asked about the methods Alex used to gather the information she provided. In the early days of her employment, Alex had assumed Garrett's silence was a sign of his trust. Years later, after witnessing firsthand the behind-the-scenes shenanigans of her fellow investigators, she knew better. Garrett didn't ask because he didn't want to know. Alex's situation at Lancaster and Jordan was complicated. Alex held some indefinable need to impress Garrett, and it forced her to perform a delicate balancing act that plagued no other investigator at the firm. She was willing to bend rules and laws, but would never put Garrett in jeopardy. Their relationship was complex, and had originated the moment Garrett had barged into the interrogation room the night her family was killed. She had been just 17 years old when Garrett and Donna Lancaster entered her life. With her parents gone, no other family to take her in, and the only home she'd ever known roped off with crime scene tape, she had nowhere to go. Garrett and Donna convinced a judge to grant them temporary and anonymous custody because her ordeal had started when Alex was a minor and was still ongoing when Alex turned 18. The terms of her release from juvenile detention included stipulations on guidance and supervision. Alex agreed to stay with the Lancasters when they offered to take her in. Her court case against the state of Virginia commenced a few months later, rushed to trial by the egregious nature of what had taken place, and by the legal might of Garrett Lancaster's law firm. Throughout the trial, no one in the media had uncovered that Alex was staying with the lawyer who represented her. And this many years later, none had sniffed out that she was working for that same man who had saved her life. As Alex hurried across the street now, she knew the building would not be easy to access, but it was far from impossible. She just needed to stick to the plan. She'd done a run through the day before and was confident she'd have smooth sailing tonight, at least getting as far as Zell's apartment door. There, she'd need to rely on skills learned during her apprenticeship with Buck Jordan if she hoped to get farther. She passed the front entrance and turned the corner into the parking garage. She used a card key stolen the previous day to gain access, then snuck through the aisles of cars until she came to the service elevator. where she punched in the 4-digit code, also stolen, that allowed access. Alex assumed her movements were being recorded by the security cameras that hung from every corner of the garage. She was confident that the ball cap, sunglasses, and extra-large Columbia raincoat would camouflage her size and gender. She was confident, too, that the security cameras on the 38th floor had been disabled. Since the police and the press had incinerated her old life, and every friendship from high school, her only friends today came from the 71 days she'd spent in juvenile detention. It was a kinship made up of a group of unlikely allies forced to fight for each other inside Allegheny. Once the lights went out and the true delinquents roamed the floors, those relationships had lasted and included a short list of people who were more than willing to take odd jobs from Alex when she needed something shady. For tonight's mission, she'd paid one of her juvie friends $1,000 to spray paint over the security cameras on the 38th floor, where Byron Zell's apartment was located. If he came through for her, and she knew he would, he'd be sneaking off the 38th floor right about now. After pulling open the accordion doors to the elevator, she took a quick look at the parking garage to confirm she was alone, then climbed inside. A minute later, she exited on the 6th floor, as high as this particular elevator rose. She'd mapped out her route the day before, first with a copy of the building's blueprints, which she'd downloaded from the county's website, and then with a practice walkthrough. And now she easily snaked her way through the maze of utility rooms. Approaching midnight, the janitorial crew was sparse, and Alex met no opposition as she darted from room to room. She finally pushed through a door and emerged into the main hallway. A standard passenger elevator was just around the corner. She pressed the call button and waited only a few seconds for the doors to open. Inside, she hit the button for the 38th floor and kept her head down, using the brim of the ball cap to shield her face from the elevator's security camera. Less than 10 minutes after watching Byron Zell leave the building, Alex was standing in front of the man's apartment door. On her recon visit, Alex had dressed as a custodian and blended in with the scores of people hired to clean and maintain the building. During a sweep of the 38th floor, Alex had snapped a photo of Byron Zell's apartment door and spent the rest of the night inspecting the lock to see what she was up against. Now she pulled a leather case from her back pocket. The lock-picking tools, originally gifted to her by Buck for her 1-year anniversary with the firm, had served her well over the years. This many years later, the small leather folder felt familiar and comfortable in her hand. She pulled the tension wrench from the set and chose the proper size pick, determined during her research the previous night, inserted the wrench into the core of the door's lock, twisted it slightly to the left, and kept steady pressure on it. Then she inserted the pick above the wrench and went to work on the puzzle inside. Picking a lock was just that, a puzzle. Instead of scattered jigsaw pieces, the riddle of a lock was figuring out the binding order of the locking pins and how much pressure was needed to set them. Attempting this on a lock never worked on before was called a blind pick, and Alex had a great deal of experience with it. This particular deadbolt had 5 pin stacks. She closed her eyes and moved the pick to each stack, feeling for the one with the most resistance. Once she found it, the second stack in this case, she bent the pick upward to set the top driver until she heard it click into place. She went back to the first stack and started again, this time finding the new resistance on the 4th pin. She set it in place with a gentle flick of her wrist. Repeating the process for each of the 5 pins, it took just over 3 minutes until she had each of them set in place. She turned the tension wrench, grabbed the handle of Byron Zell's apartment door, and pressed her thumb down on the latch. The door opened like magic. Inside, she placed her tools back in the leather wallet and slipped them into her pocket. The apartment was dark, and she took a moment to allow her eyes to adjust. Then, she slipped her hands into a pair of latex gloves as she crept through the apartment. She was after one thing, and one thing only: Byron Zell's financial records. Using a small flashlight to guide her, Alex found the man's office, sat behind the desk, and fired up the computer. The screen came to life and lit the room in an eerie blue glow. Her first bit of luck was that Mr. Zell had not password protected his computer. Scrolling through his files, she was in Zell's financial documents folder a few minutes later. There was no time to read them, but that had never been the plan. Copying the files was too risky, as she might leave behind a digital fingerprint in the process. Alex's plan was much simpler and left only Byron Zell as an accomplice. Alex quickly logged into the man's email account, which was password-sensed. Composing a new message, Alex attached each financial document to the email, addressed it to Garrett Lancaster of Lancaster and Jordan, and titled the email "Private Documents for Your Review." In the body of the email, Alex typed a single sentence. "Mr. Lancaster, attached are the documents you requested. Byron Zell." Alex sent the email and then logged off the computer just as her phone buzzed. "Yeah," she whispered when she raised the phone to her ear. "He's back," Buck said. "You've got to move." "Back? Meaning?" "He just walked into the lobby. He's probably in the elevator by now." "Shit. Buck? You just saw him? He appeared out of thin air?" "Yell at me later. But right now, get the hell out of there, Alex." Alex ended the call, slid the phone into her pocket, and put the computer to sleep. She set the chair back into place and hurried through the apartment. She checked to make sure the lock engaged after the door clicked behind her, then wiped the handle with a cloth and hustled toward the elevator. As she was about to press the call button, the elevator sounded, indicating an arrival from the lobby. She turned and sprinted down the hall, pushing through the stairwell door just as Byron Zell appeared in the hallway. Alex prevented the door from fully closing and stared through the crevice between the door and the frame. She watched Zell walk down the hall away from where she hid in the stairwell, insert his key into the lock, and enter his apartment. Once he was inside, she allowed the stairwell door to close before scampering down the steps to the floor below. There, she walked into the hallway and caught the elevator on the way down to the 6th floor. She wound her way back through the custodian rooms, took the service elevator down to the parking garage, and was out on the main street a moment later. She opened the door to her SUV, climbed behind the wheel, and looked at Buck. "You did that on purpose, didn't you? What are you talking about? You waited until Zell was in the lobby before you called me." "Of course not," Buck said in a faux tone meant to convey his shock at the accusation. "I got distracted, that's all." "Bullshit. Buck Jordan does not get distracted on stakeouts." Buck only smiled in return. Alex shook her head and started the engine before putting the SUV in gear. "I could have used an extra minute," she said. "I nearly ran into him on the elevator." "How'd you do otherwise?" Alex nodded. "I got everything we needed." "Then I'd say it was a successful nighttime just right." Chapter 22. Manhattan, New York, Friday, March 3rd, 2023, 9:20 a.m. Laura McAllister was as nervous as hell as she sat on the set of Rock. Wake Up America, the #1 morning program in the country. She could hardly believe she was sitting across from Dante Campbell, the queen of morning television. Earlier in the morning when Laura had arrived at NBC Studios, the showrunner had set her up in the green room. Before long, Dante Campbell had walked through the door to introduce herself and welcomed Laura to the set. Now, the lights were blinding and her skin was hot. Her armpits were sticky and her blouse clung to her back. Her mouth was cotton dry, and she thought about reaching for the glass of water the producers had set on a table next to her. But she worried the glass would slip from her clammy hands. Instead, she stared at the television camera just like she was coached to do, and tried to breathe easy, hoping that when she spoke her voice wouldn't flutter, and her words wouldn't catch in her throat. The producer yelled last-second instructions and Laura heard a countdown begin. Then suddenly the set was silent, but for Dante Campbell's voice. "Journalism is a popular major on American campuses," Dante Campbell said to the camera in her perfect, practiced pitch. "More than 15,000 students graduate each year from 4-year programs. with hopes of entering the world of journalism. When communication majors are included in the total, the number is even larger. I, myself, was once a journalism major, and I'm sitting here today because of the path I chose in college. But the face of journalism is changing. Social media is allowing a wider variety of voices to be heard, and some journalists are breaking stories in ways not possible just a few years ago. Podcasts, Substacks, and other non-traditional outlets are allowing journalists to tell their stories and reach their audience in new and unique ways. Laura McAllister is a perfect example. Laura is a senior at McCormack University, a small liberal arts school tucked in the heart of Washington, D.C. Only 1,500 students attend McCormack University, which is why Laura's story is so impressive. As a freshman, Laura spearheaded a small university radio program called The Scoop, which was originally meant to be a casual show about gossip and pop culture that a few of her friends might listen to. Today, Laura is a senior, and The Scoop is something much more than a university radio program. Laura has managed to grow her tiny show into something heard around the country, and we're very happy to have her with us this morning. Dante took her gaze from the camera and looked at her guest. Laura, welcome to the show. Thank you. It's great to be here. The words came out clearly and without a stutter. You've become the epitome of making a small voice heard, and heard loudly. The Scoop broadcasts from a tiny studio on the campus of a tiny university. You and McCormack University were kind enough to allow our crew into the studio last week to take some footage. But despite the small size of your microphone, a lot of people are listening to what you have to say. I've been really lucky to have such support from the school, and for some of the stories I've covered to be so widely distributed. And that's what I wanted to talk with you about this morning. The distribution of news and information today as compared to years ago, and the way social media is changing journalism. Decades ago, most people got their news from the evening newscast or the local paper. Cable news grew that medium in the 1990s. The advent of the internet yet again changed the landscape of news. And now, social media is repaving the information highway. Dante Campbell glanced down to the index card on her lap. During your sophomore year, you produced a show highlighting the ways colleges and universities can make campus life and the thigh. College experience as a whole, safer for female students. You secured interviews with a wide range of experts who not only pointed out inherent dangers on college campuses, but offered ideas on how to fix them. Through word of mouth, that episode spread from McCormack University to other campuses. I heard about it and linked to it on my own social media accounts. Now today, many universities, including McCormack, have adopted all or part of the Safe Haven project you called for. One major strategy of Safe Haven is university-hired and background-tested drivers to shuttle students from off-campus sites safely back to dormitories. An idea that has been adopted by colleges around the country. It's a remarkable accomplishment when you consider that your episode, just based on the bandwidth of the studio, was meant to reach the 1,500 students who attend McCormack University, but went on to reach nearly every campus in the country. Yeah, Laura said. I'm still blown away by how big that episode became, and how widely adopted the Safe Haven project has been. I'm really proud of that episode, and grateful that so many administrators were able to hear it. Not just hear it, but listen to the content and take action. And I wanted to pass on my gratitude to you for linking to my story and introducing your followers to the Scoop. Dante smiled. Of course. It was an important and powerful story. You're a senior now at McCormack University. Where do you see yourself after graduation? And what role do you see social media playing in your career? After graduation, I see myself pursuing some form of investigative reporting. Where that will be, and in what form, I'm not sure yet. As far as social media goes, I think there are lots of pitfalls for sure, especially for younger kids, and girls in particular. But I also believe, if used correctly, A lot of good can come from those platforms. I was perfectly happy broadcasting my little campus radio show to anyone at McCormack University who wanted to listen. But I'm thrilled to have found a larger audience. And I understand that with a larger following comes more responsibility to report not just interesting stories, but accurate ones. And that's a pivot for you. You've described yourself as a gossip girl. I think the term you used was pop gosses to describe popular gossip that you oftentimes cover on your show. I'm a pop culture addict, and I don't think that will ever change. A big part of my audience loves the show's take on pop culture, and I don't see that changing. But yes, once my platform started growing and more people started listening to the in-depth stories I was covering, I did have to pivot, but it was natural for me. I never wanted to be an entertainment reporter. I always planned to cover more hard-hitting topics. The campus safety issue was just the first of, hopefully, many more. Which is a great segue to my next question. What can we expect from you and the Scoop during your final semester at McCormack U? One good thing about being a student journalist, rather than a real one, is that I can pick and choose what I report on, and I do it without deadlines. I have a few things planned for the Scoop before I graduate. Any hints? Laura smiled. I guess you'll have to tune in to see. Spoken like a true journalist. Great to have you on the show, Laura. Keep up the good work. And I can't wait to see what blockbuster story you cover next. Later that morning, Laura McAllister's social media accounts topped 1 million followers. She was indeed becoming a force to be reckoned with. Chapter 23. Washington, D.C., Saturday, March 4th, 2023, 11:58 p.m. It was late on a Saturday night when the girl found herself alone. In a tucked-away room of the fraternity house. Not alone. She was with a guy, but away from her friends she'd come to the fraternity party with. She remembered a dark stairwell and shuffling feet, and the guy laughing and urging her on. She remembered a hand under her arm, assisting her up the stairs because her legs were weak and her balance was off. She hadn't had much to drink, but she had a low tolerance to begin with, so it was possible she tried to convince herself that she had overindulged. She usually stuck to hard teas and seltzers because they tasted good and were no stronger than beer. Tonight, though, at the fraternity party, she had accepted a red Solo cup filled with punch served from a giant vat behind the bar. Now, her thoughts were cloudy and the room was spinning. The face of the guy who brought her here was blurred and wavy. His voice was garbled like he was talking underwater. He lifted her arm by putting gentle pressure on her elbow, raising to her mouth the hand that held the Solo cup. He told her to drink up. Despite her reluctance to drink more punch, she obliged. She couldn't remember the guy's name now. She and her friends had decided at the last minute to go to the after-hours fraternity party, and the guy she was with now had found her near the dance floor. He'd flirted with her for a while, and before long she was talking to him in the corner while her friends mingled. Now, somehow, inexplicably, she was alone with him, despite that she couldn't remember exactly how she had gotten there. She felt him kiss her neck. The stubble on his chin startled her. She forced herself to laugh despite feeling terrified, and tried to lift her hand to push him away. The muscles of her arms, however, were too weak to fend him off. She tried again, with the same result, and felt like she was in a dream she couldn't wake from. She swallowed hard as the guy continued to kiss her neck, then her lips. He thrust his tongue into her mouth, and all she wanted to do was get away from him. Then she felt him press her shoulders backward. She tried to resist as he pushed her onto the couch. Hey. She woke on the floor, the matted carpet clawing at her cheek. When she opened her eyes, she was stunned by photophobia and a headache that emanated from behind her eyes and ached deep into her brain. The first thing she noticed as the light sensitivity dulled was that she was not wearing pants. Disoriented and mortified, she sat up and covered herself with her hands. Her bra was still on, but her tank top was pulled up over her breasts. Her jeans were in a heap next to her. and her underwear was wrapped around her left ankle. She reached down quickly to pull them up, fighting a second wave of aching in her head before noticing the stabbing pain between her legs. Adrenaline allowed her to ignore the discomfort while she scrambled for her jeans and pulled them on. She looked around and tried to figure out where she was. Snippets of memory came back to her from the previous night. The party. The fraternity house. Her friends on the dance floor, drinking and having fun. But then her memory ended. It didn't fade out or have segments missing. It was gone entirely. She couldn't remember a thing after the dance floor. Not about her friends, or about how she ended up here. On the floor next to a couch in what looked like a room inside the fraternity house. Getting to her feet was difficult due to both the headache and the pain between her legs. Something was wrong, and she feared the worst. She looked for her shoes, but abandoned the search to attend to the urgency she felt to get out of the house. She walked to the door and opened it to find a hallway that led to a staircase. She took the stairs gingerly, placing one hand on the railing and the other over her abdomen as she descended. When she opened the door at the bottom of the landing, brilliant morning sunlight assaulted her eyes with a searing agony that pierced through her head. Her ears rang. Outside, she gained her bearings, realizing she had exited the fraternity house into the back parking lot. Her apartment was 2 blocks away, and she carefully made her way there. When she reached the parking lot of her apartment complex, she fumbled her car keys out of the pocket of her jeans, held the key fob over her head, and pressed the button several times until she heard the chirping horn of her car. Squinting against the sunlight, she stumbled to her vehicle, opened the door, and fell into the driver's seat. 10 minutes later, she walked into the emergency room and approached the reception desk. She was happy to see a woman behind the counter. She suddenly and inexplicably worried less about her disheveled appearance, wild hair, smeared makeup, and no shoes, than if a man had greeted her. "Hi," the woman said with concern. "How can we help you, sweetie?" "I'm a student at McCormack University." The girl swallowed hard as tears filled her eyes and ran down her cheeks. "I think I was raped last night." Chapter 24. Washington, D.C., Monday, March 6, 2023, 9:10 a.m. Larry Chadwick had been anointed, although not beckoned by God. Himself, the Honorable Lawrence P. Chadwick of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, had been summoned by the President of the United States, and that was damn close. Rumors came and went over the years about Larry's name being added to the short list of potential nominees for the Supreme Court whenever the next vacancy came around. But Larry had seen too many of his colleagues place too much hope on such unlikely odds. So much, in fact, that when they were passed over for the appointment, the regret derailed their careers. Larry's objective had never wavered. Do the job, do it well, and do it honestly. And when honesty was not possible, and there were many instances when it was not, cover your tracks well enough so that whatever oversight committee decided to take a look would find nothing. As he ascended up through the courts, Larry had been aware that the eyes of the country's elite and powerful were watching his every move, evaluating his character, and charting his rulings in some unseen database that weighed the pros and cons of his opinions, positions, and politics. He played the part and acted unconcerned with those keeping score. He stuck to his plan, believing that someday, perhaps, his name would come up. That day had finally arrived. Larry had been shortlisted to fill the most recent Supreme Court vacancy, which opened when Jonathan Miller died the previous month. Justice Miller's death was not a surprise. 88 years old and obese, the man had battled diabetes his entire adult life. Not even a pancreatic cancer diagnosis could entice the man to step down. A stubborn old-school Southerner, he battled through 2 years of chemotherapy without missing a day of work before he died in his sleep. Justice Miller's ailing health had long been a political talking point, and the new administration had come into office with a list of potential nominees to replace him. 12 nominees made up the list, but most were just for show. The candidates were diversified and distinguished, and offered hope to just about every voting demographic. When the list was boiled down, however, only a couple of nominees rose to the top. Lawrence P. Chadwick was one of them. Larry cleared his schedule for the afternoon, and now stood outside his DC office, wearing a crisp charcoal suit and navy tie. The black SUV with tinted windows pulled to the curb, and Annette Packard, the FBI special agent assigned to scouring through his life, climbed from the passenger seat. "Larry," Annette said as she walked toward him with an outstretched hand. "Good to see you again." Larry shook the woman's hand. "You too, Annette." They shared the fakest of fake relationships. They pretended to like each other, when in fact they each had a vested interest in seeing the other fail. Annette Packard was the gatekeeper to his spot on the Supreme Court. Her job was to pick through Larry's life and find any and all transgressions that might make him a poor choice as the president's nominee. Larry's job was to make sure she found nothing. "I'll brief you on the way over," Annette said, opening the back door of the government SUV for Larry to climb in. Larry took his spot next to a serious-looking man in a buy-one-get-one Brooks Brothers suit. The driver in the front seat appeared to be wearing an identical suit. "Sir," the man said with a slight head nod as Larry settled in. Larry offered an awkward smile as the SUV pulled from the curb. Annette turned so she could speak to Larry over the front seat. "The president is in a meeting with the Foreign Intelligence Committee. He's due to finish at 10:10. He's set aside 30 minutes to speak with you." This would be Larry's third meeting with the president, third and final, if the rumors were true. If all went well during the next month, the next time he met with the leader of the free world after today would be during a public meet and greet in the Rose Garden, in front of the entire press crew. It would be then that the country would know for certain that Lawrence P. Chadwick was the president's choice to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court. For the past 3 months, Larry had met with members of the Secret Service and FBI, Annette Packard being the point person and overseeing the process. She poked around Larry's past, formally termed the debriefing and vetting process, looking for red flags that could hurt his chances of making it through the grueling nomination process. More than that, Annette looked for things that would prove embarrassing for the president. This vetting process was a forensic examination of a candidate's life, and Larry had learned through his own research that Annette Packard excelled at it. She'd vetted senators, congressmen and congresswomen, vice presidential candidates, and governors. Larry Chadwick was her first Supreme Court vet. Starting with his high school days, Annette Packard had methodically picked her way through Larry's life, sniffing at anything she found suspicious and turning over any rocks she believed might be hiding secrets. Annette did this from his teenage years to present day. She was searching, Larry knew, for transgressions, embarrassing gaffes, stupid mistakes, cover-ups, crimes, or anything unsavory that might cast him, and therefore the president, in a bad light during the confirmation hearings. "Trust me," Annette had told Larry during an initial meeting. "If you did it, we'll find it." They could look, but Larry was confident they would find nothing. Early on, Hunt set his life on the correct trajectory. The son of a Navy commander turned prominent businessman, Larry grew up sailing in Connecticut and attending private school. The worst thing he'd done in high school was break Renee Beckham's heart when he dumped her for a cheerleader. But even this minor transgression, Larry believed had been atoned. He married Renee 5 years later when he was a first-year law student. That their marriage had survived 25 years and produced 3 children was evidence that Renee had forgiven him. The extracurriculars since then were well buried, and Larry was confident Annette Packard would not dig deep enough to find them. If Larry's high school experience had been benign, his college days had been anemic. At Yale, he'd never fallen under the myth of secret societies, had rejected the lure of fraternity life, and had spent most of his time in the library. His 3 years of law school at Duke had been crowded with books, work, and internships. Larry Chadwick had simply never found time to get into trouble. So, Annette Packard and her team of FBI agents and the Secret Service goons who were picking through his life could look all they wanted. There was nothing to find. At least, nothing they would find easily.